Today's watercolor tutorial is something special for the holidays and something for the absolute beginner. Download and print my wreath illustration so that we can paint together. Hi guys, welcome back. My name is Shayda, and on this channel I do art tutorials for the absolute beginner and beyond, and today is no exception. In fact, today's video is perfect if you have always wanted to try watercolor or you're just getting into it but you're feeling a little intimidated, because today we're going to do a watercolor wreath paint along. And you'll really get to paint with me, because what I've done is I've created this wreath illustration, and it's going to be available on my Patreon site after today's video so that you can paint along with me. You'll be able to print this, and the idea is that you can print it on 90-pound watercolor paper. That should go through a printer just fine and paint on the printout. Or you can do what I'm going to do in this tutorial, print it on computer paper and then transfer it to watercolor paper using a carbon transfer sheet. And we'll talk more about that later. But it's my hope that you'll really get a chance to see how I would paint. We'll talk about wet into wet versus wet on dry, and we'll talk color mixing. And I've designed the wreath in such a way that the illustration coming through the light translucent watercolor paints, I think looks really pretty. So I'm hoping that you're going to end up with a good lesson in watercolor, but also a piece of art that you're really proud of and that you can enjoy making. So with that said, let's get started. Remember, you can grab the wreath on Patreon after today's video. All the channel bonus content is available for a couple bucks a month. And if you are not a patron, not to worry, you can totally design the wreath yourself and paint along with me. We have lots of tutorials on this channel on wreaths and floral illustration, and I will link them below. So let's start with a talk about supplies. I'm going to be painting on 140-pound hot pressed paper today. It's nice and smooth. It's going to take the transfer well. Cold pressed is fine. And then here is my printout. I've just printed this on computer paper. This is exactly what yours will look like if you print it out. It fits onto the 9x12 paper really well. I'll tape it in place, and then all you need is carbon transfer paper or graphite transfer paper and a nice sharp pencil. So those are the main supplies for transferring the image, and after that we're just using regular watercolor paints. So what I'll do is I'm going to grab this transfer paper. You can see it's very dark, it's messy and smudgy, so be careful with this stuff. You don't want it getting everywhere. You'll have little black fingerprints, so you might want to wash your hands after handling it. And I just place it under the image, and then I start going over the entirety of this printable with a nice sharp pencil. A mechanical pencil is great for this. And you might think it would take a long time to trace over everything, but it really doesn't. It's such a mindless task, and it just takes, 4 or 5 minutes, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. Once you've completed the trace, you can lift up the papers and take a little peek, make sure you've got everything. I actually missed a spot, but I'll just draw the leaf in. No big deal. If you miss something, you can always retransfer or just, draw one random leaf in there to fill the space. So now we're ready to paint, and today I'm going to be using 2 pointed round brushes. These are both sable hair, a number 6 and a number 4. I will link those brushes in the description, and then I'm using my set of Mungyo Pan watercolors, and I will link that as well, but you should feel free to use any watercolors that you have at home. And we'll talk about color mixing, but I'm just going to start painting with a few of these flowers just to show you how the paint will go on right over the transfer. And it looks beautiful. I love the way the illustration looks when it sort of comes through. I've drawn it in a really sketchy way, and I think it looks quite pretty under the paints. Today I'm using a color palette of very light peachy pinks and these minty gray greens. So let's talk about that. I'm using these 3 colors here, the white, yellow, and peach, and I'm kind of mixing all of them together with quite a bit of water. So a little bit of peach, a little bit of white, lots and lots of water. And then you could also mix in a little pink. If you look at my palette here, I've actually mixed up a sort of a yellowy peach and a pinky peach. And then I've got this nice dark rich red in the middle. And then for that rich red, I've mixed together red and pink with a bit of orange And then I'll also mix in some brown because I want this color to be very dark and rich, and it's a nice contrast with the pinky peaches. Let's put this on the paper so you can really see. I'm using that kind of yellowy peach for part of this flower. Then I'm going to mix in that more pinkish peach and do some of the petals in that color. And I just love the way those two shades work together. Then when you add this really rich orangish red, almost a maroon color, I think the contrast is lovely, and there's something quite wintry or Christmassy about it as well. So let's hit the paper again, and for most of these I'm not overthinking it. I'm just almost just coloring in. You can see I'm just filling in the areas with the watercolor paint, trying not to overwork the paints, try to still paint those petals with 1 or 2 brush strokes, and of course you can add that nice dark rich red in there as well at the center of the flowers. I'm filling in this flower by mixing both the yellowy peach and the pinky peach for a nice subtle contrast between those two light shades. And then I'll add that really dark red, and then I get a nice high contrast between the very light peach and that rich, almost maroon color. And now let's start adding some color to some of the leaves. I've mixed up this very gray minty green, and we'll talk about how to mix that in a moment. I'm going to start painting some of the leaves. This is a chance to practice your brush strokes. Try painting the leaves with a single stroke of the brush. Really run the belly of that round brush across the page. You can play a little with wet into wet, releasing darker color into the wet area and letting it seep out. So let's take a look at how I'm mixing this. The Mungyo set has quite a dark minty green, so I'm starting with a dark green, but then I'm mixing in purple. Adding purple or violet to the green gives it a bit of a gray tone. It mutes it slightly and helps with that minty touch. I'm also mixing in a little bit of French gray, and the French gray is very light. It's almost like I'm adding a bit of white, and I've added a lot of water as well. Now, if I put this on the paper, you can see the colors that are developing. On the one side of the palette, I've mixed up quite a dark minty green, and then on the other, I've added a lot of water so that I've got a more transparent color. I'm also mixing up a warmer green, but it's very muted. I'm starting with a sort of a pea green, and then I'm mixing in a little bit of purple, and I'll also mix in a little bit of red. Now, if you don't have a sort of mossy or pea green on your palette, start with a bright green and you'll just need to mix in more red. Red is across from green on the color wheel, so that contrasting color, it sort of deadens the green slightly, and it gives us this really beautiful, interesting shade of green that I just love. The more red or purple that you add to that green, the more it lies somewhere between green and brown, and I think that is just so pretty because it looks like this very mossy green, and the combination of the very mossy green and the minty green is quite pretty, I think, as well. And you can see as I add this to the wreath how the two look together. Remember, this is a great chance to practice your wet into wet watercolors. You can lay down quite a light wash of color. Try to do it in 1 or 2 brush strokes, 1 leaf, and then come back in with a slightly darker shade and just play around. See what happens when you just put a spot at one end of the leaf or maybe a line down the middle. Allow that color to seep out into the wet area. On this minty green leaf, I am filling it with a very, very light minty green. So light it's barely there. And then while it is still wet, I'm coming back in with a darker color and adding a bit of detail to the center. It's very messy and free, but I love the way it looks. I think the coloring page, because you're not worrying about form, you don't have to think about the shapes of the flowers and leaves. My hope is that it frees you up to focus on the technique. So play around a little with wet into wet. Just splash those paints on the page and see what happens. The next thing that we're going to do is mix up a very dark green in order to paint some of the pine, some of the evergreen that is part of the wreath. What I'm doing here is mixing a little bit of gray and even a little bit of black into the green, and I'll come over here and I'll show you the sort of color that I've mixed up. It's quite dark and I like that. I'm using my pointed round brush and I am allowing the paint to flow through just the tip of that brush. That's the nice thing about a pointed round. It has a very fine point, so you can do these thin lines with a relatively large brush head. So you can see here I'm just painting these tiny thin lines to create the look of the pine needles, and I need a very dark green to do this. On scrap paper I'm going to show you why, because when you do these extremely thin lines, even a dark green can look quite light. So I'm using a navy blue for this. This is just navy blue now, and it's giving me the look of a very dark evergreen. And now I'm going to add a little more greenery here, and for this one, this is almost a black. I've mixed green with a lot of black to give me a very dark color, because as I said, those thin lines, they often look lighter than you want them to. It's also a nice idea to kind of bleed out some of those pine needles, make it look a little messy. You don't want anything too perfect. So adding a little extra water, either right after you paint or right before, can help make things look a little more whimsical and a little more free, which I really like. Now that we've painted many of the flowers, leaves, and pine, the wreath is really coming together. And so now what I'm doing is mixing up a dark, rich purple. This is purple with a lot of dark gray and dark blue, like a navy blue. And I am going to use this dark color to add some small details. So part of the wreath design is these tiny little leaves or berries. I've drawn them all throughout the wreath, and they just add a nice element of detail because they are so tiny, and they're great practice for your brushwork. You can always grab a super small pointed round brush for this, something like a number 0 or number 1, but you can also use your number 4 or number 6. That's what I'm doing here. You should be able to get those small details with a larger brush because, of course, the pointed round brush has that very fine point. So this is great practice. You don't have to get them perfect, just add a splash of color there and they look great. And then I am adding that really rich maroon red that we mixed up for the center of some of the flowers. I'm going to use that same shade for the larger berries, and I'm just adding a bit of that dark red. I love the way it makes the whole color palette come together. The minty washed out greens and the washed out peach, it comes to life when you add that nice rich red. So that's what I'm doing here. And then I also had to finish 1 or 2 of the flowers. I'm adding some light bluish purple berries, and they're just sort of part of the evergreen. And then finally, I am going to do a bit of shading, I guess we could say. I'm using darker greens and I'm doing a bit of wet on dry. So now that my painting has dried, I have a lot of control and I can add a bit more detail. And I like to come back in with very dark greens and just add a splotch of color on one or both ends of the leaf or one side of a leaf. You can be very free with this. You can be very detailed if you want to add some tiny little lines to the leaves, but you can also be a bit messy with it and just lay down a dark splotch of color, and it really brings a nice contrast and life to the piece. For the flowers, you might add a little bit of a darker peach or pink around their center. And I also like to add a bit of a yellowy peach to these very pink ones because I just think that's a very subtle contrast, and I'm able to get more detail now that everything has dried. So that's what I'm doing here, adding that little bit of subtle detail. Again, this is such great practice. You're not worrying about form. You just have to think about the color and the painting. And then I am mixing up a dark brown. This is brown with a bit of gray and purple mixed into it to really darken it. And I'll use that to complete the berries. There's something about the brown that really grounds the whole color palette, and I'm also going to add it to the center of some of the flowers, and it will help complete the bottom of the wreath, which is really just one naked branch. Paint that bottom twig or bottom part of the circle out in brown or any color you like. And then what I'm doing to finish the piece is I've mixed up a very light gray and I'm adding some random leaves. It feels good to kind of paint outside the lines, and it's a nice way to put a finishing touch on this wreath. And that is my wreath all done. I love this color palette, and I love the design because I think it can really help you learn and enjoy the painting process as a beginner. That's what the wreath looks like all done. Remember, you can print this out, download and print it by signing up for my Patreon site. All the channel bonus content is available there, and it's all available for just a couple bucks a month. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with a new tutorial.